Throughout the mid to late 2000s and early 2010s, it felt like one simply could not move for zombie-based media. Movies like 28 Days Later, World War Z, and Shaun of the Dead dominated the box office. The Walking Dead and its billion-and-one spin-offs were plastered all over our television screens, and hordes of undead-based video games shambled their way onto our PCs and consoles. Not every title featuring brain-munching monsters is a Resident Evil 4 or a Last of Us, however. And you know us, there's nothing we love more than games that many consider worse than most. So, for today's list, we're diving into the world of video game zombies, which, on reflection, probably isn't a very good idea. Perhaps better to go tentatively in whilst clutching a shotgun in order to find the most rotten of the lot. These entries were picked based on their critical and audience reception, and just a little sprinkling of our own personal opinions. I'm that one person who definitely isn't hiding a bite I recently acquired, potentially putting the whole community at risk. Ashton from TripleJump, and here are the 10 worst zombie video games of all time. Number 10. Daymare 1998, 2019. We're kicking off today's list with a game that's less worse than many, but still more worse than most. And yes, our writer is penning this script in the new year, before the mince pie and alcohol-induced haze has worn off. Why do you ask? Released for PC in September 2019 and for PlayStation 4 and Xbox One in 2020, Daymare 1998 is a title of the survival horror Persuasion, which tells the tale of a secret research facility in which a deadly chemical weapon has been unleashed. As 3 different protagonists, an elite soldier, a helicopter pilot, and a forest ranger, players must search the facility for clues, all whilst keeping bloodthirsty creatures at bay with limited resources. Daymare 1998 was clearly trying to recreate the feel of classic survival horror titles of the 90s, but unfortunately it missed the mark by a decent amount. It did a reasonable job with its gameplay mechanics and story, evoking titles like the OG Resident Evil to a certain degree, but it had far more flaws than strengths, and ultimately was let down by unmemorable enemy and boss design, poor collision detection, sluggish controls, and a frustrating inventory system. Put simply, this was one Daymare players couldn't wait to awaken from. Number 9. Overkill's The Walking Dead, 2018. Considering how big the franchise has become, it's not all that shocking that not everything bearing the good name of The Walking Dead is worth writing home about. Case in point, Overkill's The Walking Dead, released exclusively for PC in November 2018. You lucky PC lot. Overkill's The Walking Dead takes place in a post-apocalyptic Washington, D.C. and places heavy emphasis on cooperative first-person shooter gameplay, with players each controlling one of our 4 characters, Maya, Aiden, Grant, or Heather, as they work together to complete various objectives, all whilst fending off monsters who would love nothing more than to nosh on their cerebral cortex. The game isn't completely without merit. The gunplay is fairly competent and everything looks quite nice, but sadly a game can't get by on working munitions and pretty environments alone. Overkill's The Walking Dead was heavily criticised for its repetitive gameplay, lengthy missions without checkpoints, ridiculously long load times, and myriad bugs and glitches, all of which led players to wish they were playing another, more competent co-op shooter, like Left 4 Dead, or even Overkill's very own Payday 2. You maybe shouldn't have been so eager to put your name on this one, Overkill. Number 8. The Walking Dead Survival Instinct, 2013. I hope you didn't think that we were done with The Walking Dead, because the franchise has another stinker up its sleeve. In fairness, most zombie sleeves are probably rather stinky, but you get what we mean. The Walking Dead Survival Instinct had the misfortune of releasing shortly after Telltale's The Walking Dead, a game which many will agree is nothing short of being one of the finest zombie titles of all time, which meant that Survival Instinct was perhaps judged even more harshly than it would have been under normal circumstances. Survival Instinct serves as a prequel to The Walking Dead TV show, and follows fan-favourite character Daryl Dixon and his brother Merle as they make their way through the Georgia countryside in order to get to Atlanta in the early days of the Walker apocalypse. Critically panned, The Walking Dead Survival Instinct got basically everything wrong. Its storyline was bland and uninteresting, which, coincidentally, are descriptors players also gave to the game's environments. Resource gathering was also forced on players, because nothing screams high-octane action like going on a hunt for Twinkies or whatever. Well, actually, I think that is the plot of a high-octane zombie movie, but I digress. And on the whole, the game was a broken, ugly, buggy mess. Number 7, Zombieland Double Tap Road Trip, 2019. Speaking of Twinkies, here's a Zombieland game. The first Zombieland is a brilliant, hilarious, action-packed romp for a post-apocalyptic United States, whilst its sequel is... well, it's just kind of unnecessary, isn't it? As such, it should come as no surprise that its tie-in video game is a massive letdown as well. Released in October 2019, 3 days before the movie it tied in with, Zombieland Double Tap Road Trip, a moniker with entirely too many punctuation marks, takes place between Zombieland and Zombieland Double Tap, and sees our 4 protagonists, all of whom, with the exception of Abigail Breslin's character Little Rock, are voiced by horrible sound-alikes, travelling from the west coast to the east coast. The twin-stick shooter was completely lacking in the movie's humour, the dialogue was painful to behold, and the gameplay was so unimaginative that players couldn't do anything but to label the whole thing a lazy cash grab. And a cash grab Double Tap Road Trip was, offering a lousy 2-hour campaign, yet demanding players shell out 35 quid to subject themselves to its abhorrence. Suffice it to say, the only road trip this game should be taking is to the nearest dump. Number 6, Metal Gear Survive, 2018. Many game series went through a bit of a phase around the late 2000s and 2010s, opting to bring zombies into previously relatively grounded universes. The Call of Duty franchise has had great success with its zombies modes, and many gamers look forward to the annual COD release to see what those shambling brain chompers are up to this time. Regrettably, not every franchise has had success with zombies, as was the case for the Metal Gear series. Metal Gear Survive is generally considered to be the worst Metal Gear title of all time. Released in the wake of Hideo Kojima's dramatic departure from Konami, it was supposed to serve as proof that the studio didn't need the visionary game designer, but really only ended up being evidence of quite the opposite. The problem with Metal Gear Survive was just that it was no fun. Players found the missions to be incredibly repetitive, survival mechanics tedious, and the overall pace of the title to be slower than a snail on a leisurely Sunday afternoon stroll home from the pub. Maybe it was worth focusing on yourselves for a bit before trying to prove to the world that you're better off without your ex. Hey, Konami. Number 5, Resident Evil Survivor, 2000. The Resident Evil series is well known for producing some of the finest survival horror games known to mankind. The original Resident Evil, along with its sequels 2, 3, Nemesis, and 4, are all considered brilliant by the gaming community, as are 7, Biohazard, and Village. Unfortunately, not everything slapped with the Resident Evil brand is a winner, as is evidenced by the next 2 entries on today's list. The first game Capcom would probably rather we all forget is 2000's Resident Evil Survivor, a first-person shooter that takes place just after the events of Resident Evil 2 and 3. In Resident Evil Survivor, players take on the role of an amnesiac helicopter pilot who crash lands on Sheena Island, which, unfortunately, happens to be the location of Umbrella Corporation's private township. Whoopsie. Attempting first-person gameplay long before Resident Evil 7 came along in 2017 and actually got it right, Survivor is just awful. Firstly, its Western release lacked the light gun support featured by its Japanese counterpart, which royally hacked off players. Its controls were wonky, with players unable to even look down to spot crawling zombies, and the whole thing was little more than an exercise in tedium. When even playing Resident Evil 6 is a better option, you know you done goofed. Number 4, Umbrella Corps, 2016. Hang on just a second there, Resident Evil series. We're not quite done with you yet, so sit back down. You've still got Umbrella Corps to answer for. Indeed, despite Resident Evil 5 and 6 being roughly as well received by many players as a swift jab in the eye with a pointy stick, it would seem that by 2016, Capcom still hadn't learned that what Resi fans wanted was more spooks, less shoots, which is presumably why they thought Umbrella Corps would be a good idea. Umbrella Corps is a multiplayer tactical shooter in which players must cooperate with fellow mercenaries in order to eliminate enemies on the opposing team, as well as the computer-controlled zombies that roam from the maps. The issues with Umbrella Corps were twofold. Firstly, and as we've already mentioned, this wasn't really what any Resident Evil fan wanted. And secondly, everything Umbrella Corps tried to do had been done better elsewhere, and it was compared rather unfavourably to the games in the Call of Duty series, whose online multiplayer modes were far superior, as well as to Resident Evil Operation Raccoon City, which was also not very good, but admittedly not as bad as Umbrella Corps. Number 3, Land of the Dead, Road to Fiddler's Green, 2005. We've got another movie tie-in for you now, and as you've probably guessed, this one's the cruddy cash grab released alongside the legendary George A. Romero's 2005 zombie flick, Land of the Dead, a film which is generally well regarded by horror fans. Alas, the same cannot be said of Land of the Dead, Road to Fiddler's Green. The game takes place before the film at the outbreak of the zombie apocalypse, and centres on a farmer named Jack, who awakens one day to find his farm overrun by the undead. Knowing he cannot possibly hope to survive in his current location, he heads to the city in search of help. Utterly incompetent first-person shooter gameplay, horrible visuals, broken AI, and a plethora of bugs and glitches all came together to make Land of the Dead Road to Fiddler's Green an utter farce of a title. Not only is it one of the most awful zombie video games ever made, but, based on its average review score anyway, it was the second worst game of the year 2005, out-rubbished only by Crime Life Gang Wars. Land of the Dead, more like Land of the Dread full video game. Got him. Number 2, Infestation Survivor Stories, aka The War Z, 2012. Whether you know the game as Infestation Survivor Stories or by its original title, The War Z, there is one thing that's for sure. It's a shambling mess of a game, and not the sort of shambling mess one might want from a zombie title, might I add. Infestation Survivor Stories, which we will be talking about in the past tense, as it has now been shut down, was an open-world survival horror in which the idea was to collaborate with other players in order to survive. Players needed to find food, water, and shelter, all whilst trying their best to not get munched on by a passing zombie. The reaction to the alpha version of the game was fairly positive, with reviewers saying that despite the bugs, Infestation Survivor Stories showed promise. Unfortunately, the studio really plops to the bed with the full release, which was an ugly, poorly designed microtransaction abomination made worse by the seemingly endless parade of controversies the developer found itself embroiled in. Thankfully, no one will ever have to experience this disgrace of a game ever again, as its servers were taken offline in December 2016. Now that is a Christmas present we can all enjoy. And number 1, The Slaughtering Grounds, 2014. We have to be a bit careful criticising The Slaughtering Grounds. After all, if we're too mean about it, there's a good chance developer Digital Homicide Studios will slap us with a lawsuit. So, in the interest of not getting sued, all of the following things we have to say about The Slaughtering Grounds are unproven, conjecture, hearsay, etc, etc, etc. Now delisted from Steam, The Slaughtering Grounds was a multiplayer arena shooter that is perhaps most notable not only for supposedly being perhaps the worst zombie game ever, but one of the worst games of all time, full stop. You name it, it's ostensibly wrong with The Slaughter Grounds. Crappy graphics, horrid sound, wonky AI, bugs, glitches. I could go on, but we'd be here all day. The Slaughtering Grounds was allegedly a steaming hot pile of garbage, and its developers purportedly didn't exactly help the image either. One NeoGAF forum user by the name of Mr. Luchador found that the devs had possibly been peppering the game's Steam page with positive reviews. They were found to have potentially used copyrighted assets as part of the game's logo, and they also attempted, and failed we might add, to sue James Stephanie Sterling for their comments on the game. No need to stick an allegedly on that last one, that is just straight up fact. Right, well, we'll have to wrap it up there. We're running out of words that will protect us from any erroneous slander claims.